This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hi, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. This is episode 1. My guest for this episode is Katherine Stewart. Katherine is most recently the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Her book provides a comprehensive overview of the various tactics Christian nationalists have used to enact their agendas in American society and politics, from currying favor with the powerful and inventing the myth that the religious right's first and primary concern was abortion, to their attacks on public education and how they have mobilized conservative religious voters using sophisticated data modeling. This is a wide-ranging conversation and still only manages to scratch the surface of what is covered in her book. You can find The Power Worshippers at your local bookstore and on Amazon, and you can support the show by purchasing it using one of the links in the show notes. Without further ado, let's get to this conversation. My guest today is the journalist Katherine Stewart. She is most recently the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed your book, and I'm excited to talk through all the different things that you tackle within it, because I think it really summarizes a lot of the different elements of Christian nationalism that we are facing here in the United States today. Where I really want to start is that in your book, in the introduction, you make a distinction that Christian nationalism is not a religious creed, but in your view, a political ideology. You even go further than that and actually say that the ideology is not conservative as it purports to be, but is in fact radical. Can you talk about the ways in which you decided to frame your work in the book and how you approach Christian nationalism?
Sure. The representatives of Christian nationalism insist that the foundation of legitimate government in our country is bound up with a reactionary understanding of a particular religion. So it's not a particular religion per se, it's really an anti-democratic movement, anti-pluralist, anti-equality. It basically says the United States is founded on the Bible and can succeed only if it stays true to this foundation. And it's not only an ideology, it's also a device for mobilizing and manipulating large segments of the population by getting them to vote for certain political candidates. And therefore to concentrate power in the hands of a new elite.
And one of the things that is often the case in discussions about Christian nationalists or evangelicals is actually the fact that a lot of times when we have discussions or the media is covering these groups, the terminology gets a little fuzzy. And one of the things you say also in the introduction is that your book isn't necessarily about evangelicals.
Oh, absolutely.
How did you, while writing this book, really approach terminology and the ways in which it can make covering these sorts of things and discussing them on a broad level somewhat difficult?
Yeah, well, first to your point about evangelicals, the movement includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too. And it includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. Ultra-conservative Catholics play a strong role. I think a lot of people underestimate the Pentecostal and certain representatives of Pentecostal and charismatic forms of religion as well. What unites the movement is really not a distinct theology. There are a lot of different theological distinctions, but more a common political vision. And in terms of like the language, it is, it's really hard to describe what we're looking at, because what we're seeing in America today is something I don't think we've ever quite seen before. I make use of a lot of different terms throughout the book. I use the terms religious right, Christian right, fundamentalism where appropriate, dominionism where appropriate, and other terms. I use the term religious nationalism in the subtitle of my book, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, because I wanted to make clear the similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. So
Mm-hmm.
when we see political leaders in other countries like Russia, or when we see Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Duda now in Poland, binding themselves to religious conservatives in their countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. We're seeing that in America today with Trump and his alliances with religious hyperconservatives.
Mm. What do you think is the best succinct sort of definition of Christian nationalism, if your hope is to make that distinct from a particular type of religious viewpoint, like evangelical, for instance? And I mean, the evangelical community, that's the place I come from personally. Like, there is perennial discussions about what it truly means to be evangelical. If you get really in the weeds, you talk about the Bevington Quadrilateral, or whether it's more social or religious or political, like all these different ways in which to approach a term like evangelical. But I do think that there is value in the type of terminology that you put forward of saying Christian nationalist or religious nationalist. So what would be your definition of that as a terminology to be able to identify and classify something as either religious nationalist or specifically as Christian nationalist?
Well, nationalism has always in the past and present been a way of uniting people, less around some love for a particular identity than hatred for others. Paranoia is one of its defining features, and this paranoia often manifests in a persecution complex. It's a way of defining the us versus them, the pure versus the impure, the true patriots or those who are here by invitation only. I think recognizing that paranoia and persecution complex is absolutely essential to recognizing religious nationalism in America today. And I also think we have to note, too, that religious nationalism in practice almost never comes to an end in genuine theocracy. Some people say, well, aren't these theocrats? Well, what they're agitating for won't really result in a Christian democracy. The natural destination for this kind of religious nationalism is kleptocracy, led by corrupt, often, irrational, nepotistic, autocratic leaders, in which organized hypocrisy takes the place of religion. Does that sound familiar today? I think it does.
Yeah, I think
right. Go on.
absolutely. I think that sort of behavior is evident in the ways in which Christian nationalists have taken advantage of the Trump administration as a willing participant to that sort of kleptocracy and disconcern for the rule of law or democracy.
That's absolutely. I mean, these, rather than uniting the population, these kinds of governments tend to deepen existing divides. And you can see this in the hyper-partisanization of the Trump administration. You're with us or you're against us. You're one of the good people, or you're demonic, like they literally demonize their enemies. You notice, I've been researching this movement for over a dozen years and have attended innumerable strategy meetings and gatherings and summits, Valerie's voter summits and the like. And their political opponents are not represented as people with a legitimate but different point of view. They're just represented often as truly demonic. which is why I actually love the title, Power, Principalities and Powers, which is, I hear this, the rulers of the darkness, I hear this quote from Ephesians used often to represent the sort of political opposition to what this movement wants, to political opposition to its aims.
That is the way in which they mobilize, is by those deeply moving sort of religious imagery and everything. It's been that way for decades. I actually think that's a good segue to a follow-up question in regards to, even though you see this more as a political ideology,
Mm-hmm.
what is the relation to overall religiosity? We're speaking at the end of July 2020. We're in the midst of a pandemic, but there are also these books and articles being published about this movement as well. And one that was just published yesterday was actually by Robert Jones from PRRI, talking about how there's actually a correlation between higher church attendance and support for the Trump administration. So, like, religiosity does play a role, but how can we make distinctions or understand the role of the people that are the supporters, and maybe what might be different about the leaders of these movements and the people that are actually jockeying for power and doing those things within the halls of Congress and elsewhere?
Sure. Well, first, I want to say that the doctrines of religious nationalism tend to reinforce authority, of scripture, of course, but also the authority of, religious and political leaders. And these doctrines make an absolute virtue out of, or obedience to, a literalist or strict interpretation of their religion. And this is very handy both for the clerics and politicians and the elites that they serve, because it reinforces their authority, power, and privilege. So I do think it makes sense when you're examining the movement to distinguish between the leaders and the followers. I think when you're talking about, the people whose votes are supporting the movement, you're talking about the rank and file. You're talking about a large group of people with a very wide range of interests and concerns. And many of them, when they vote for the hyper-conservative political leaders that the movement favors, they're really not, they're voting to end abortion, or they're voting to defend what they think of as the traditional family, or reunite church and state. They're not making arguments for radical reorganization of government as it exists. They're really kind of making a statement about their own identity and what they value in themselves. And I think a lot of them would frankly be surprised to learn of all of the policy proposals that their leaders are advocating, in particular in the area of economic policy. But for the leaders of the movement, we're talking about the heads of the right-wing policy organizations, the data organizations, the legal advocacy groups, the legislative initiatives, and the like. What they're arguing for is a more authoritarian form of government. It's a radically anti-democratic movement. And they, want a lot more power for themselves and their networks and the political leaders that they support. And in large part, they want a larger share of public funds in order to sustain their movement.
This is something that has been key part of Republican politics for a long time, is that they advocate supposedly for smaller government, but then do also fund radical expansions of government power and government spending.
Government spending for them. I mean, it's interesting. The movement has for years allied itself with libertarian, hyper, conservative, pro-corporate wing of the Republican Party. And what they're advocating for are policies that are intensifying economic inequality, which is, you just look at economists and social scientists. This is just very well documented. Our, income inequality in our country is at sort of really extremely high levels. It's just, there's so much further to fall down the economic ladder. And I always find this to be a huge irony, in that, the religious right is always pretending to support family values, but they're advocating for economic policies that make it so much harder for families to succeed. So, like, if you look at the right-wing policy groups like Family Research Council, they'll say things like certain forms of government aid, like job training or help with housing or food aid for poor families and things like that. They'll say that this is against the biblical model. But at the same time, they really want to expand, and they are expanding government funding to right-wing religious organizations and churches so that they can supposedly, deliver these services to people. They want the money to flow through the churches so they can, number one, bolster their own organization, get direct government funding of their churches and clergy and right-wing organizations, and also deliver those services with certain forms of proselytization, either implicit or explicit.
You mentioned the Family Research Council, and I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the key organizations and the key leaders that are part of these groups that are doing the lobbying actively right now. They have been for decades, but then have made a lot of progress towards their goals during the Trump administration in particular. In your book, you talk about attending a Family Research Council event in 2018. Can you talk about what sort of leaders spoke there and what their goals were and how they were trying to convince pastors to effectively lobby their congregations for these conservative causes?
Sure. Well, the Values Voters Summit happens every year. I tend to go every year. It's a gathering of some of the most powerful religious right leaders and activists and the politicians that they favor. So at that 2018 Values Voters Summit, Ralph Reed, who's the head of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, he's been in the movement, a movement leader for many years. He's very clever politically. And it's all designed to sort of turn out the vote. They were really talking about getting out the vote for the midterm elections. And Ralph Reed said, if we do our jobs, they're going to be more shocked this time than they were the last time. He was referring to 2016 and the fact that so many, people in the center left miscalculated the power of the so-called values vote. The sort of, what George Barna, the evangelical pollster, calls the sage cons, the sort of most fervent religious right voters. So Reed also pushed back at that event on the idea that race was a pivotal issue when it came to the vote. He said, if you back the evangelicals out of the white vote, Donald Trump loses with whites. I mean, if you think about it, to see the power of that vote, we can look to that pollster, George Barna. This is a movement that represents a minority of the population. Barna estimated that the most fervent religious right supporters, a group he calls sage cons, are only 10% of the population. And yet 91% turned out to vote in 2016, and 93% of those voted for Trump. So you can see that this disproportionate, the small group punches above its political weight disproportionately because they're so coherent and organized. At that time, Ralph Reed also said something to the effect of, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. So all of these different speakers and breakout sessions were all intended to sort of turn out the vote. I remember, Marsha Blackburn, who's a Republican representative from Tennessee, she was running to replace Senator Bob Corker at the time. She said something like, you've all heard the Democrats say they're going to have a big blue wave. We have to make sure that blue wave goes crashing into the Great Red Wall. So it was all about turning out the vote.
Right.
At a breakfast event, I heard religious right leaders say, this election is all about judges, 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 before praying that Jesus would be, quote unquote, restored as King of America once again. I mean, this hits home the fact that a lot of support for a lot of these movement leaders is about the courts. I think the movement, to an incredibly underappreciated degree, derives much of its strategic direction from the courts. They want judges favorable to their position, the so-called culture wars, but also judges who are going to vote in economic policies that are favorable to the pocketbooks of the wealthy. I remember, another movement leader, David Barton, saying something to the effect of, if I want to know if someone's going to take care of my money, I want to see how they vote on abortion. So abortion becomes sort of they are uniting these sort of hyper-conservative, positions in the culture wars with hyper-conservative economic policy. And that explains a lot of their loyalty.
Yeah, yeah. And that is one thing that your book also captures well, as the sort of the maneuvering around things like, quote, values votes and that sort of thing as indicators um, of alliance, but also, as you mentioned, the deep financial interest that is at stake for a lot of these groups. One of the things that sort of criticisms that many evangelicals who try to distance themselves from, I believe, I forget who came up with the term core evangelicals. It might have been John Fee
John
or
Fee.
John Fee.
Yeah, it's John Fee.
Yeah. Um, they try to distance themselves from that sort of thing. Yet, even if they do that, there are still machinations happening that support continued Christian nationalist efforts. And they, even though they are utilizing the Trump administration, they predate and will continue to persist after this administration is done. After it's done its time, they have certainly tried to stack the courts, as you've uh, during this period. Just they're trying to reap what they've sowed in that regard. Um, One of the things that was really eye-opening to me in this financial aspect, in particular, was these sorts of interests that were present at an event hosted by, I believe, Ralph Drollinger and Capital Ministries that you attended. Can you talk about these sorts of industry leaders and other leaders that pour a lot of support into these lobbying groups and other groups, and how they can also use and support these types of Christian nationalist initiatives?
Sure. I mean, the movement, has various sources of funds, but a big source are these, plutocratic donors, many of them belonging to um, hyper wealthy extended families. I'm thinking about the Prince DeVos family, the Wilkes brothers, the Mercers, McClellan, the Green family, so many others that I describe in my book. And some, it's interesting. I learned a lot about how the theology that's promoted by some of the um, religious leaders is, so favorable to these kinds of plutocratic fortunes. When I attended this event in the San Joaquin Valley for Ralph Drollinger, he's the founder of Capital Ministries, which targets political leaders at the top levels of government. And he's got this weekly Bible study group in the Capitol that's been attended by like 12 current and former members, at least, of Trump's cabinet, including Vice President Mike Pence, who's listed as a cabinet sponsor on Drollinger's website. And Drollinger also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and House of Representatives. And he's established affiliated ministries, not only around the world, it's in about 80 countries, but also in every state. So he is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America.
Hmm.
So the expansiveness of his positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy really hits home the fact that this is a political movement, not really a stance in the so-called culture war. So, and a lot of it is about money. So he argues, of course, in his Bible studies, which none of it is hidden. It's all on his website. You can look it up. It's, I think, catmin.org. And he's published a couple of books on the topic. He's got these Bible studies, which he teaches to these political leaders. And he says, he promotes the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He's against progressive income taxes. He's against taxing the rich proportionately. He at one point goes on some screed about how we need to adopt the flat tax now. He's against government regulation of businesses. He's referred to environmentalism as a false religion.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got a whole bunch of other terrible beliefs, like, women should be subordinate to men at home and in church and things like that. His beliefs are troubling because they are radically anti-democratic. He thinks we need a biblical basis of lawmaking, which of course relies on an incredibly reactionary understanding of one particular religion. So much for the Constitution. I mean, so much for the values of equality and pluralism that have sustained our country, even as so many others have been torn apart by sectarian conflicts. So much for, rational thought. I mean, his vision, explicitly marries conservative religion, hyper conservative religion, with libertarian economic policies that are hollowing out our middle classes and making it so much harder for families across the economic spectrum to succeed.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to give you one example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he cites, I think, the first letter of Peter, which goes something like, "Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but to those who are unreasonable." Listen to this. Not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. So Drollinger cites this passage. A lot of ways to look at this biblical passage, but he explains, the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was of slave and master, but the principle of submitting to one's boss carries over to today. Think about that. I mean, he's modeling it on the economy of slave and master and submitting to one's boss. And you've got not only the good and gentle, but also the unreasonable. Are you kidding me? I mean, this is music to the ears of the, very wealthy business leaders and plutocratic funders, many of whom are relying on minimal workers' rights and economic and environmental deregulation to maintain and increase their profits.
Yeah, that sense of understanding the Bible as a way to shore up and continue to hoard power and authority is definitely not a strange it is a strange teaching to an outsider, but to someone even within a quote unquote moderate sort of evangelical background, those sorts of things, those sorts of ideas have been floating around for decades. But what we have here is someone that has access and capital, both social, political, and financial capital, to the most powerful people in our government.
I love that you use the word hoard, Blake, because it's actually, this isn't wealth creation. This is actually a way of impoverishing the nation. It's a way of, impoverishing most people, while folks at the very top are actually hoarding. It disempowers the people. It's radically anti-democratic. It's cruel and unfair, and it ensures that people will be unfairly compensated for the work that they do.
It's bad. I'm not. I don't have a clever segue for that, because whenever you sit to think on it, it's discouraging. However,
it's true, and we can also see that this is a theology, as you mentioned, that has a kind of a history. It has roots in mid-century opposition to the New Deal, and I think even further back than that, to pro-slavery theology. And it couldn't be more different from progressive Christian theology that emphasizes racial justice, fairness and equality, care for the poor, and for the undefended. It's a very different vision of Christianity that perhaps most American Christians endorse.
Right. Yeah, that is one of the things that makes discussing this hard, especially if someone does not have that particular familiarity with these types of beliefs or these types of groups. And that's what is helpful about books like yours, is that it contextualizes those things for an audience that might not be familiar with it. And one of the ways in which your book does that is by talking about another key figure. And I'm going to segue to talk a little bit more about the longer history of Christian nationalism, and the different ways in which this group did not emerge out of a vacuum, and it didn't emerge during the response to abortion. It didn't emerge with Trump. It's actually been working steadily towards these aims for a very long time. And one of the people one of those leaders that you focus on as one of these Christian nationalist architects is, I've actually never heard his name spoken out loud. I've only ever read it. So if I mispronounce it, I apologize. The person is Paul Weyrich.
I had to look it up myself. It's
Um,
Paul Weyrich.
Weyrich,
I know, but
yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned him. Honestly, he was like, I felt like I could write a book just about him. He's fascinating, man. He's like one of the most intriguing characters I've come across in a long time. He was perhaps, he's the leader of a movement called the New Right. It's a
Hmm.
precursor to the religious right of today. And he was perhaps one with the broadest vision. His fellow conservative activist, Richard Viguerie, who pioneered the practice of data collection and direct mailing for fundraising, said, I can think of no one who better symbolizes or is more important to the conservative movement. What he meant is like a new conservative movement.
Hmm. Yeah, and one of the most telling quotes that you have of his is that he saw his aims and his groups as first establishing themselves as first as the opposition, then the alternative, and finally the government. Um, and it's hard to not see that as how it's sort of come to pass, at least in 2020. I certainly have a pessimistic view of things right now, so that might be coloring the ways in which I read that quote now. But what, how did he help build the new right that became the religious right, and how do you think that the Trump administration and the current Republican Party is continuing to work towards those aims?
Sure. Well, Weyrich was motivated by kind of visceral anti-communism, economic libertarianism, hostility to civil rights movement, hostility to women's equality as well. And he was, radically anti-democratic. He said something that actually I heard Trump say. I think we all heard it, right? It was caught on radio or something. Weyrich said, in 1980, I don't want everyone to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections goes up as the voting populace goes down. And this is something Trump said a few months ago on radio, I believe. Um, so, uh, so here's how he did it. He and this group of folks, who's allied with a number of Southern white conservative pastors, who were, including Jerry Falwell, who are closely involved with segregated schools
Hmm.
and universities. One of them was Bob Jones Sr., who went so far as to call segregation God's established order and referred to desegregationists as satanic propagandists who are leading colored Christians astray. As long as these religious leaders thought they had a right not just to segregate people, but also to receive federal money for the purpose. So they coalesced around the fear that Supreme Court might end tax exemptions for segregated Christian schools. And Weyrich was really upset about this as well. But, among other issues, he was also upset about, he felt like the Republican Party was too soft on communism. He was upset about school prayer issues and the like. But they knew in order to sort of ignite a kind of hyper-conservative counter-revolution, as you mentioned earlier, they wanted to be like first, the opposition, then the alternative, and then the government. So they needed a rallying cry, but they knew that like stop the tax on segregation wasn't going to be an effective one because it's so ugly, isn't it? So there's kind of fascinating episode that the historian Randall Balmer describes where they get together and basically went down a laundry list of issues that they thought might unite their movement. Now, this is about 1979 or so, 6 years after Roe versus Wade. They hadn't been particularly concerned about abortion at the time. So number one was, of course, what they viewed as the threat to the tax privileges, racist academies, and there were others on the list. But then they got to abortion, and it was like a light bulb went off. And Weyrich said, basically, that could work. So, part of the history that's really been erased by movement leadership and many conservative-leaning American voters is that people have been persuaded over time that the movement today was ignited around the issue of abortion, but that's simply not true. It wasn't. I mean, when Roe versus Wade was passed, most Protestant Republicans supported it. I mean, Betty Ford hailed it as a great, great decision. When it was passed, even the Southern Baptist Convention ran an editorial in one of their wire services hailing the decision.
Hmm.
Ronald Reagan, as we know, passed the most liberal abortion law in the country in 1967.
Hmm.
Conservative hero Barry Goldwater, who, by the way, Weirich worshipped, he supported abortion law liberalization at least early in his career. His wife Peggy was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona, and the two of them actually arranged for an abortion for for their daughter. I think when she was about 23 years old and was facing an unintended pregnancy. But Weirich and other activists like Phyllis Schlafly, Schlafly in particular, saw the potential for this issue to unite the new movement. So over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. And today we see a kind of almost like a pro-life religion taking over this cohort. And it's a modern creation, and it was created for political purposes.
Right. One of the things that is glaring to many people who do not identify with that type of religious fervor in regards to abortion is the way in which someone who can be pro-life but also pro-death penalty or not, or pro-family separation at the border, or the ways in which that is not consistent. In the 80s, there was a movement called the Consistent Life Ethic that was pro-life and also anti-death penalty and all those sorts of things. That was a sort of response to that. But nonetheless, the ways in which we've seen it evolve today, I know I'm in the Chicago area. A couple of weeks ago, I was running an errand, and I saw people holding anti-abortion signs on the side of the road. And these are people acting with extreme religious fervor. I don't even think there was like an abortion services clinic nearby. It was just on the side of a road.
I think that movement leaders know if you can get people to vote on a single issue or maybe two or three issues, you can control their vote. So they've worked really hard. When leaders of the movement are talking to the rank and file, when they're talking to pastors about the issues, they should talk to with their congregations. It's been and many times in recent years all about abortion, and we all know people who have justified their vote for Trump by saying, well, at least he's pro-life, you have to vote pro-life, that's what my pastor says, it's the most important issue of our time. So that's one of the ways that they do it. I mean, there are a couple of other issues that really animate the movement now. It's interesting. I was recently attending an event online, because everything's online, Evangelicals for Trump. And it was kind of surprising. Abortion wasn't mentioned until the 33-minute mark. Instead, it was all about religious liberty, religious liberty, religious liberty. And religious liberty was used as code for getting public funding for our organizations, direct taxpayer funding, government funding of churches. This is a complete, direct, radical violation of the First Amendment as it's always been applied. We've never had a situation where you're getting the government paying pastor salaries or things like that. Now we have it, thanks to the pandemic. But they were using it a lot of different areas. There are a lot of ways in which the leaders of the movement want to open the spigots for government money flowing to churches. But abortion has typically been it. And I wondered, why are they not really talking about abortion? I mean, they did talk about it at the 33-minute mark, but I also thought perhaps during the global pandemic that's killing people and efforts to sort of cast sort of social distancing and mask wearing as somehow hostile to our religion. Maybe the pro-life message is something they're going to put in the back burner for the time being. But believe me, it'll come back with full force. And, I've gone every year for the past few years to the Evangelical for Life conference and March for Life events. And it's really interesting to go to those events. I think for a lot of the women in the movement, it's largely a patriarchal movement, but women know that if they want to have a path to sort of political power in that movement, they kind of have to pass through the funnel of pro-life activism.
Right.
It's sort of like you need to, and it's like they need to be the most fervent defenders of life because it's like the men hide behind the women.
Yeah, and that's very true, and that is definitely the case in a lot of those conservative evangelical or conservative Christian spaces, where women are only granted that level of autonomy in very particular spheres of influence. Another Another common experience is that if a woman feels compelled to be a spiritual leader, she may only be allowed to teach children. And
Hmm.
some places she may not be allowed to teach children, and in other, and there's a sort of racial prejudice and colonialist bent on you could be a missionary and teach someone that is not white, but not other white men. You wouldn't be able to have authority, and that goes again back to some of the beliefs and teachings about women's submission to men in these organizations and these communities. It's a very good point how that is a way in which women can exercise some sense of their own power in those very,
Hmm.
very tight, constricted things. And even within my my time, I feel like those types of organizations continue to get more constricted and the areas get more defined and smaller, unless you're a white guy, and then all the power is yours.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like the promise is, for like, the ideology, the promise is for, males, you have to submit to us, to your authority, the church leaders and sort of authorities of us, but your reward will be that you'll get a woman to submit to you. Um, it's really interesting. I mean, I find those, I find those kinds of ideologies really constricting. But they're mainstream. That's a funny thing. Like you've got Ralph Drollinger, who number one advocates for women's submission, but it's so authoritarian. He also has this whole study where he talks about you have a biblical duty to actually do physical to beat your children, and a failure to do so, if you fail to do so, you're being selfish and you're challenging your own future in heaven. It's incredibly, frankly, I think it's very sick. I'm a mother. I would never strike my children.
Right.
It's just not how you get them to behave. I and I hear from people all the time who really struggle with that sort of legacy of abuse. It just makes them feel terrible. Early in my journey in this world, when I first started, even before the Good News Club came to my kids' school in Santa Barbara, this is like 12 years ago. I was living in Santa Barbara in a Good News Club, and that's sort of how I got interested in this whole movement. I had a friend. So our public school was in the same district as Westmont College, which is a very well-regarded evangelical college. And
Mm-hmm.
all of my friends who were school moms were affiliated with Westmont. They were either wives of professors or they were professors themselves. And one of my best friends was a wife of a professor, and she had, a lot of kids, and she, was a wonderful person in many regards, but she, I think, kind of fell down the sort of path of a kind of fundamentalist theology. And at a certain point, we're on one of our walks, and she just shocked me. She said, "I beat my children, and I hit them hard enough because I want and to hurt, and I want them to fear the Lord. I want them to fear the Lord, and I want them to fear authority." And I just couldn't believe it. And then she started describing how one of her daughters, she said, "But I'm really worried because one of them is starting to become very masochistic and saying, 'Mommy, mommy, I'm so bad. You have to beat me.'" And I just thought, well, what do you expect that you're doing to your children when you beat them? You're going to warp them and screw their minds. I mean, it was just so disturbing and
Mm.
upsetting and really kind of astonishing. And then it was only a little bit later when I started reading the works of James Dobson, who advocates physical punishment, and then Daniel Pearl and some of these other fundamentalists who actually advocate for beating your children so that they fear authority and fear the Lord. It's a way of turning people fearful and authoritarian, and
Mm.
making them. And as I was writing my book, I kept coming across pastors who would describe this very ritualized forms of abuse that they would subject their own children to. And it was just one of the most disturbing aspects of the research and reading that I did. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It's very troubling.
And I hear, as I'm sure you do, from people who have survived this and come out of it, and it's really screwed them up. It's in multiple ways. And, then they spend, much of their lives trying to sort of shake this, feeling that they're bad, and this feeling of, the sort of dysfunction that this type of
Right.
abuse inculcates in them.
Yeah, yeah. And coupled with teachings of things like original sin and total depravity and all of those types of beliefs, it reinforces that for sure.
Yeah, and I don't want to suggest that all people, conservative folks, are beating their children. Far from it. This is just describing, of course, a segment of that movement. Although I do think it's shocking that folks like Ralph Dollinger, who has such an a broad and powerful platform, is advocating for it.
Right. Right. And what I do think is important, though, what I do think is important is the way in which these things that are hard to necessarily identify or name, they have become these types of cultural norms and these things that are accepted and general practice in a lot of communities and by a lot of individuals. And that is actually one of the ways in which the groundwork has been laid through things like education. And you touch on that in a couple of different ways. And power worshipers, one of them is by talking about the ways in which American history has been recast as this Christian type of redemption story by people like David Barton, and then as well as very specific moves, lobbying efforts by the now Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and her family. So education and the ways in which these groups try to form young minds, it's inherently connected to the types of behaviors that you saw in your friend. In that regard, what did you learn about David Barton and his goals? I know that like I went to a Christian college. I didn't read David Barton, but I did. There was one particular book that I had to read as part of my American history course. I was a history major, and one of them was called The Light and the Glory, and it was all about Christian, like America as a Christian nation. And it was very colored by these sorts of things that I can now name. I didn't as a young 19-year-old, as things like Christian Reconstructionism and Dominionism. I can now name those things, but I couldn't then. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit of that's a tangent there. But returning back to the ways in which people are developing, like Barton, are developing curriculum and affecting even federal curriculums, and why education is so important to these groups to continue to propagate their access to power and their ability to exercise authority.
Yeah, well, you get the kids, you get the culture, right? I remember Matt Staver at one event I went to saying, he's the head of the Liberty Council. It's one of the right-wing legal advocacy groups, saying, if you want to change the direction of the cruise ship, you got to target that age group. I think he said like 5 to 12 or something, or maybe 4 to 14. He said is the most strategic age group that we have. They actually refer to children as strategic machinery. So, I mean, this goes back to, David Barton and this sort of Christian nation myth. I mean, he tells, as you know, he's a sort of hyper conservative, quote unquote, historian whose works have been debunked many times. But he tells the religious right stories that they want to hear. The stories are fundamentally false or often misleading. There's sometimes, some truth in them, but then there's sort of misleading context. But, that doesn't stop him or them, the fact that he is often criticized even by evangelical professors, at conservative evangelical colleges. These myths are necessary to provide cover for the great lie at the center of the Christian nationalist movement. What Barton and other leaders of the movement don't want us to know is that America was proudly created by our founders as the world's first secular republic. Um, no, he in his telling, the founders were in fact Bible thumpers, intent on establishing a conservative Christian nation. But it's really untrue. I mean, America today is diverse, but even at the time of the revolution, it was always, also really diverse. Um, the colonial period, we had Lutherans, Catholics, Congregationalists, Unitarians, Presbyterians, and a whole bunch of other sects, many of which hated each other. It also included a number of doubters or non-believers. So the idea that
Mhm.
America ever had a single unified religion is false.
Yeah, in my education, it was the people that were hailed as the example, the prime American Christian example, was the Puritans, which is odd because they have a very checkered record. They're not by any means entirely laudatory, or they even had practices that I think purity culture and abstinence and that sort of thing would be uncertain about by today's standards. But nonetheless, that was the example. But to your point, it was far more diverse than that. But those types of schools, the Christian schools and other places, they do not teach that. It's pretty black and white in comparison. There's Christian and secular, or Christian and non-Christian, and non-Christians are demonized or seen as a threat.
Indeed, I think that the movement reserves a special contempt for secularists who are
Mm-hmm.
cast as being, out there ransacking everything that's holy, good, and good in society. But the movement also throws in a lot of progressive Christians in that sort of bucket, along with secularists, and says this is all false theology, and this is New Age religion. This isn't Christianity. Very interesting.
Yeah. One of the other connections that you make in the book to these folks, and this is another individual that has been covered extensively in books and other places, is Rushduni, and then he also leaned on another person from the past, Dabney. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his first name. His
It's all
first
right. Yeah, Robert Louis Dabney,
Robert
boy.
Louis Dabney. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh my God, I fell down a sort of Rushduni rabbit hole when I was researching this book. He was this incredibly influential and incredibly prolific mid-century theologian. And so, you know, he he admired Thornwell and Dabney, who were these pro-slavery theologians, and he quoted them affirmatively in a number of his works. But he not only did that, he reprinted some of Dabney's works through his own publishing house, Ross House Books. And Rushduni was founded an organization called the Chalcedon Organization. It's Christian, sort of Christian Reconstructionism. So I want to talk a little bit about first Dabney and Thornwell, the pro-slavery theologians. And then I want to sort of explain the through line between them and then Rushduni and then the movement leaders today. So these pro-slavery theologians were intensely hostile to the principle of equality, pluralism, and critical thinking. They endorsed an austere biblical literalism and rigid hierarchies, which they asserted were ordained by God. The United States, the idea of the United States as a Christian nation, chosen by God, that it should be an Orthodox Christian republic, that at some point America has deviated horribly from its mission and fallen under the control of atheist and or liberal elites. Does this sound familiar? I mean, these are the ideas that the pro-slavery theologians endorsed. They said there are these hierarchies ordained by God, white people over Black people and men over women. So this is how Thornwell of South Carolina, he and Dabney were both South Carolina members of the Presbyterian Church in South Carolina. And Thornwell described the conflict this way. He said, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. So he was writing around the time when there was a struggle over emancipation. He said, they're atheists, communists, socialists on the one side and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. So here he's identifying order and regulated freedom with enslavers and atheists with abolitionists. So Dabney too said a whole bunch of awful things. He expressed, by the way, contempt for public education because he didn't think white people should have to pay taxes to support the education of Black children, who he expressed in the most disgusting terms. I'm not even going to repeat them. He said a ton of other bad things too. He was a very hostile to science. He said the physical sciences were theories of unbelief and atheistic and unchristian. So these are the folks that Rushduni chose to not only cite in his works, but also reprint through his Ross House books, which was I think it may have been, I'm not sure if it's a division of Chalcedon or if it was Chalcedon adjacent, but it was his own publishing house.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like theirs, included an opposition to government assistance to the poor. He was incredibly hostile to public education. He actually published like a huge screed called The Messianic Character of American Education. It's like, I don't know how many pages it is, like 300 pages or even longer. I have it over there in my bookcase. It's like this long, really thick screed against public education. Um,
Hmm.
and these are cornerstones of Christian nationalism today. So, in particular, Rushduni wrote that the First Amendment, aimed to establish freedom, not, he wrote, quote, not from religion, but for religion. So we hear this phrase widely parroted by Christian nationalists of today. People like David Barton are saying it all the time, and it's become an article of faith for the rank and file. Um,
Hmm.
and other phrases of Rushduni's, the idea that social welfare programs are something like slavery to the state. These are other phrases that other Christian nationalist leaders today echo.
Right. And it's more important than ever to highlight the racist roots of things like this, and understand, given the massive national reckoning that an overdue reckoning that we're having with these ties. But it is something that, as you point out in your book, many current leaders do try to distance themselves from Rushduni, even while still espousing his beliefs in other ways. And not really, it's a pretty soft distancing. They likely don't always vocally repudiate Rushduni, right? Because he's such a powerful figurehead
Mhm.
at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it hits home the fact that the religious right in America is not really separable from race and racism, no matter how hard its leaders try to do so. And they really do try. I mean, heads of the leading religious right policy groups and their affiliated organizations, I'm thinking about organizations like Family Research Council, are making an effort to offer the appearance of diversity to their movement. They're always reaching out to conservative leaning pastors of color in order to capture a subsection of voters of color. And they do make a special effort, for instance, with conservative Latino voters of faith in certain swing districts in particular. But the fact remains that for substantial numbers of white supporters of the movement, the idea of religious heritage is closely bound up with ideas of racial heritage and
Hmm.
racial difference. And of course, religious right leaders are fighting the culture wars on behalf of a political party that promotes race-based voter suppression and race-based gerrymandering. I mean, that the sort of race-based voter suppression is astonishing. We've seen what happened recently in, I think it's Kentucky and also in Georgia, to see how Black voters have been completely disenfranchised. So not only do these movement leaders paper over the ways in which hyperconservative religion, racism reinforce one another, they've actually thrown their support wholeheartedly behind Trump, who appeals directly to the racism of his supporters.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, leads your mention of gerrymandering. I think that leads very well into where I'd like to bring things back to the present day and these sorts of very sophisticated efforts that are enacted by Christian nationalist groups. Two that you highlight in the book are Project Blitz and United in Purpose.
Mm.
And the reasons why I think they're valuable to highlight is because I do think that a lot of people that serve as this sort of public face of the religious right or Christian nationalists or evangelicals and those types of people overlap, whether they choose those labels or not. They do try to put on these affectations of having simple desires and simple wishes and things like religious freedom, as you mentioned,
Right. They
as
just want to
being
save the babies.
right. They want to save the babies. They want to practice their religion, even if that means arguing something all the way up to the Supreme Court in order to secure the right to discriminate against someone, as has
Hmm.
happened multiple times.
Hmm.
But these examples in your book illustrate the complexity and the intelligence and the drive to maximize their return on their ability to affect elections and to reach out and get out the vote and all of these other aspects of governance. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned about United in Purpose and Project Blitz? These are two different efforts, but they both are very data driven, very sophisticated, modern campaigns.
Yeah. So let's first talk about Project Blitz, and then we'll talk about United in Purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So Project Blitz is a broad and ambitious legislative initiative. And by the way, they're linked, and we'll get to that later. So Project Blitz is a broad initiative targeting state legislatures that aims to flood multiple state legislatures with coordinated, simultaneous bills in the hopes that they will eventually become law. There's literally a Project Blitz playbook, and I write about it in my book. The documentation of the Blitz shows that the movement leaders have self-consciously embraced a strategy of advancing their goals through deception and indirection. For many years, critics have warned that concessions to the Christian right on symbolic issues like erecting public monuments or emblazoning religious mottos on state property, for example, would set the nation on a course leading to the establishment of religion. And a lot of people are like, oh, what does it matter? They just want to do, and God we trust here. Well, we now know that the critics were right, because the architects of Project Blitz show in their documentation that their aim is to push the states down a slippery slope to a more biblically based society. So the Project Blitz have divided, you know what ALEC is, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council. They craft model legislation for politicians to adopt, so they don't have to research and write the bills themselves. And then they can introduce identical bills into multiple state legislatures at the same time. And that's what Project Blitz does. The architects of the Blitz have divided legislation into three categories according to level of difficulty. The first level is all about those symbolic issues, like putting in God We Trust signs in public schools and on police cars and in public buildings. So now in multiple states, a lot of those in God We Trust bills have been adopted in multiple states, including Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, a whole bunch of others. In God We Trust signs have to be, by law, prominently placed in every public school building or even in every public school classroom. But that's just phase one. I mean, as the architects of the Blitz make clear, the point of phase one is just to clear the path for phase two and phase three, both of which consists of bills that are injecting Christianity, or I should say Christian nationalist, conservative Christian ideas more directly into schools and government entities, and to legalize discrimination against those, faith-based discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
Especially discrimination against those whose actions are offend the sensibilities of conservative Christians. That sort of religious freedom is never intended for folks like me who might anchor our own sincerely held beliefs in our own sense of, deeply held conscience. So,
Mm-hmm.
So some of the architects of Project Blitz, the people who are considered the sort of, four sponsors of the Blitz, are deeply embedded in United in Purpose. I'm thinking about David Barton, who I actually call the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement. Everywhere. No, he's everywhere. Sits on the boards of so many initiatives and policy groups and, legislative initiatives. And then a fellow named Bill Dallas, who's a founder of United in Purpose.
Hmm.
So what is United in Purpose? It's a data organization, and it targets conservative churches and others in order to help turn out the vote for hyper-conservative candidates that the movement favors. So United in Purpose is really quite secretive. But what the leaders have revealed, including Bill Dallas in the interviews that they've given, is that their data organization has a massive reach. In an interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, for instance, Dallas said, we have about 200 million voter files. So we've pretty much the whole voting population in our database. And what we do is we track to see what's going to make either vote someone one way or not vote at all. Think about that.
Mm.
They target people, figure out whether they're going to vote one way or not vote at all. And they're really involved in the Get Out the Vote initiative. So they have all this data, and it includes some psychograph, like, whether a person has ever signed a marriage, like an anti-marriage equality list or an anti-abortion list, or whether a person goes to church on a regular basis, or even if a person is a fan of NASCAR or fishing. Like they try and get like all these things, and they, as Dallas has described it, they assign points to people, for certain interests. And as Bill Dallas says, if your score of, the points totaled over 600 points, we realized you were very serious about your faith, and we run that person against the voter registration database. If they're not registered, that becomes one of the key people we're going to target to go after. And here's another thing they do. They do a lot of it through churches. So a division of United in Purpose was working with conservative churches, giving tools to pastors to help them get their congregants out to vote. And they had tools that would help compare, pastors have the ability to compare congregant lists with voter rolls and see who voted in the last election. And if they hadn't voted, figuring out like how to target them with certain kinds of messages to get them to turn out to vote. So it's a really sophisticated initiative, and offering a series of very sophisticated tools. When people wonder why, and by the way, George Barna, the evangelical pollster, was also deeply embedded in United in Purpose. And if you wonder why those sage cons are voting at such high numbers, and 91% voted in 2016, 90% voted for Trump, you wonder why. And I think United in Purpose is a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. And do you think on Barna, and one follow up in regards to that group, they often are cited even in news agencies that may not cater to a religious conservative audience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that is intentional, and do you think that is in effect sort of damaging to how evangelicals or Christian nationalists are represented in broader media outlets, because they tend to be favorable to the goals? I inherently distrust the Barna polls. I don't know if that's how you feel.
Well, I think some of his polls are right. I mean, his whole identification of the sage cons. I've heard over and over at a lot of the gatherings that all it takes is 10% of the population to change the culture. And Barna's data, I think he identified a core of what they call sage cons. These are not just people who turn out to vote themselves. These are the people who will try and agitate within their churches to get their congregations to vote on saving the babies. These are folks who are going to knock door to door. He identifies it as 20 to 25 million Americans, that sort of core 10%. I think from a political voting perspective, that may be a bit too low. If you look at the work of folks like Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, in their book about Christian nationalism, they estimate the number is closer to, say, 30 million. They've also done a really wonderful job of identifying who qualifies as Christian nationalist, at least in a kind of a loose way. But those numbers aren't terribly far off,
Yeah.
So I think you can sort of pick and choose. But when it comes to listening to these leaders, I think that it's, people have asked me, is this a conspiracy? Conspiracies happen under the cover of darkness with unnamed actors. It's like this is a movement that's operating out in the open. And it's not that they're hiding, it's that we're not listening. I think we need to listen to these leaders and take them at their word. They've been telling us for years that they want to destroy the separation of church and state and, quote unquote, return our country to a time that frankly never was. And I think we need to pay attention to what they're saying before it's too late.
Absolutely. How do you think people listening to this or reading your book or people that are concerned about this sort of threat that these groups pose to democracy, so how can we work to diminish that sort of power, both fiscally and politically, and all the different ways in which these groups operate? How can people like you and I, or even people listening to the show, respond to those sorts of things? Because it feels big, it feels vague, it feels all encompassing. It's natural to have like a sort of anxious response to this sort of stuff, but
Well, we should be encouraged that we actually have the numbers. I mean, the challenges we're facing are political and the solutions are political too. There is
mm,
no substitute for the power of the vote. If
mm,
they're voting in disproportionate numbers, well, that's free to us too. I mean, one thing the religious right does well is they've created a really positive voting culture. They're not doing a lot of, oh, your vote doesn't really matter. Oh, let's vote for this third party candidate. No, they really know when unity is necessary. And they also know that it's not just about the front runner. That person might have said something stupid in 1982 or done something dumb in 1989. But you know what? It doesn't matter whether the front runner is your favorite candidate. It's really about, look at the judges, look at the people they're going to appoint cabinet to run cabinets. Are they going to appoint somebody in charge of public health who's a science denier? I mean, just
mhm,
it's really simple stuff. And I think we need to they've trained their, rank and file to vote on these larger issues. And I think if we can sort of unify at the, when it matters, not just in national elections, but also in local elections too, that really matters. So there are things we can do as individuals, such as holding ourselves in our circles, members of our family, or, faith groups, or other groups to vote, and holding them accountable and volunteering to get out the vote. But there are also things, your activism doesn't end with a vote. We should, elect great people and then hold them accountable for following through on their campaign promises. And also, I think there are things that we can achieve if we join together. I mean, protecting voting rights is massive. I think it's really the challenge of our time. Uh, Getting involved in media and messaging platforms is really important. Getting involved in think tanks where possible, donating our money where possible to organizations that support the separation of church and state. I mean, I think we're at an all hands on deck moment,
mhm.
and we all have to do our part.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for talking to me about your work and your book. Where can people find the book? Where can they find you online or elsewhere?
Oh, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to plug my book, The Power Worshippers. Please purchase a copy. And you can contact me through my website, which is katherinestewart.me. I archive a lot of my journalism on that website too. I'm on Twitter at Kath S. Stewart. There are two S's. And I always really love to hear from people. So please don't hesitate to send me a question or tell me about your own experiences. It's really nice to hear from people in this other way, even in the midst of this awful
Mhm.
pandemic that's keeping everyone at
Yes, and
home.
I do appreciate you taking the time during, again, this pandemic, to talk with me about your work. It's a vital book, and I'm glad to be able to uh, share this conversation and the book with others. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
And And that'll do it for this week's episode. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. The theme music is by Dave LaFever and Jake Lewis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts and let others know about the show. You can also support the show by purchasing Katherine's book from the link in the show notes and by signing up for a paid prescription to my newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. Talk to you soon.